The Man in the Window. On a quiet night in a small, seemingly peaceful town, the air was thick with an unsettling calmness. The stars twinkled in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the streets below, yet the darkness felt deeper than usual, almost alive. Maria, a young woman in her 20s, lived alone in a charming but aging Victorian house at the end of a narrow street. The creaks of the wooden floorboards and the gentle whisper of the wind made her feel as if the house were alive. That evening, she had settled into her favorite armchair with a warm cup of tea, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over her. A flickering candle illuminated the room, casting shadows that danced across the walls, amplifying her anxiety. The tranquility of the night was abruptly broken by an unfamiliar sound, a faint rustling outside. Maria paused, her heart racing as she listened intently. It was probably just the wind, she thought. After a moment of hesitation, Maria felt compelled to look out the window. She rose slowly, her feet dragging against the wooden floor, and approached the glass pane that overlooked the dimly lit street. As she peered into the darkness, her breath caught in her throat. There, at the edge of her lawn, stood a man shrouded in shadow, his features obscured, but his presence undeniably menacing. He was tall, almost impossibly so, and his posture was unnaturally rigid. The moonlight glinted off his eyes, which seemed to glimmer with an otherworldly light, sending chills down her spine. The man was utterly still, yet she could feel his gaze drilling into her, as if he were peeling away the layers of her very soul. Panic surged through her, and she stepped back from the window, her heart pounding like a drum. She rationalized it was just a trick of the light or perhaps a figment of her imagination, yet a sense of dread rooted itself deep within her. Maria shook off the chill that had settled in her bones, convincing herself that it was just a fleeting moment of paranoia. However, as she turned away from the window, the silence of the house was shattered by a low, haunting noise. It echoed through the halls, a soft, almost melodic creaking, like the distant call of an old, forgotten song. Intrigued yet terrified, she followed the sound, her heart racing with each step. The noise grew louder, more insistent, guiding her towards the source. She found herself at the front door, which led to the outside world, a world that suddenly felt far more inviting than the oppressive atmosphere inside. But before she could reach for the doorknob, a chilling realization washed over her. The man was still there, standing under the flickering street lamp, watching her with an unnerving intensity. In a moment of reckless bravery, Maria took a deep breath and opened the door just a crack, her heart pounding in her chest. The door creaked ominously, and she hesitated, feeling the cool night air wash over her. She dared to look out again, and to her horror, the man had moved closer, now just a few feet away from her front porch. His face was partially illuminated by the street lamp, and Maria could see his features for the first time. Pale skin stretched tightly over sharp cheekbones, and lips curled into a grin that seemed to stretch unnaturally wide. Her reflection in the glass revealed the terror in her own eyes. In that moment, she felt a pull, a magnetic attraction to his gaze. It was as if he were calling to her, beckoning her closer with an invisible thread of dread. "Do you see me?" he whispered, his voice a low murmur that sent shivers down her spine. "Maria." The whisper slipped through the night like a ghostly breeze, sending an icy chill racing through her body. The voice was familiar, yet distorted, echoing through her memories like a haunting refrain. It was as if he were calling her from a place long forgotten, a shadow from her past that she had buried deep within her. Panic and curiosity collided within her, igniting a fierce battle in her mind. "What do you want?" she finally managed to ask, her voice trembling, despite her effort to sound brave. The man smiled wider, revealing teeth that glimmered in the dim light. "I want to show you something," he replied, his voice smooth like silk, but laced with an undercurrent of menace. The shadows around him seemed to pulse, and for a moment, Maria felt entranced, as if she were caught in a trance. Despite every fiber of her being urging her to run, she found herself rooted to the spot. Before she could respond, the man gestured toward the darkness beyond her front door. "Come with me, Maria," he said, and the world around her seemed to blur at the edges. The familiar comforts of her home faded, replaced by an overwhelming sense of foreboding. Summoning all her courage, she stepped out onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath her weight. The moment she crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt charged, thick with a palpable energy that made her skin prickle. Maria glanced back at her house, feeling an inexplicable sadness wash over her. Was she truly ready to face whatever lay ahead? But the man's presence was magnetic, and she felt compelled to follow him, drawn into the unknown. As they walked, the world transformed. The once familiar street was now shrouded in darkness, the lampposts flickering like dying stars. She felt as though she were wandering through a dream filled with both beauty and horror. The man led her deeper into the shadows, his footsteps silent as he moved with an unsettling grace. "You've been searching for answers, haven't you?" he asked, his voice smooth like honey, yet dripping with malice. Maria's heart raced. "What do you mean?" she replied, struggling to keep her composure. "I'm not searching for anything." But deep down, she knew the truth. She had always felt lost, haunted by questions she couldn't quite articulate. The man paused, turning to face her, and his eyes gleamed with a knowing light. "You seek to understand the darkness within you," he said, "and I can help you find it." In that moment, Maria felt a mixture of fear and intrigue. The shadows around them deepened, and she stood on the edge of a decision that could change her forever. As Maria walked alongside him, the world transformed. They reached a clearing, illuminated by an ethereal glow. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an otherworldly light over the scene. In the center stood a gnarled tree, its twisted branches reaching toward the heavens like skeletal fingers. "This is where it all began," the man said, gesturing toward the tree. "Your past, your fears, they're all intertwined here." Maria's breath caught in her throat as memories flooded back faces of people she had lost, moments of pain and sorrow that echoed through her mind like a cacophony of ghosts. The man stepped closer, his presence both comforting and terrifying. "You can't escape your past, Maria. It will always be a part of you." The words resonated deeply within her, stirring feelings she had long buried. She felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. As the shadows swirled around them, Maria felt the weight of the truth settle over her. The man was not just a figure of her fears. He embodied everything she had tried to run away from. "I didn't want to remember," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "I thought I could forget." The man's gaze softened, revealing a glimmer of understanding. "Forgetting is not the answer. Embracing your past will set you free." In that moment, Maria realized the man was both her tormentor and her savior, forcing her to confront the darkness she had buried. The shadows thickened around them, and she felt as though she was standing at the edge of an abyss. "Will you join me?" he asked, extending a hand, his smile now a mixture of hope and despair. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her answer. And in that silence, Maria felt the enormity of her choice. Taking a deep breath, Maria reached for his hand, feeling the coldness of his grip. As their fingers intertwined, she felt a surge of energy pulse through her, and the world around them shifted. Memories flooded her mind, each one a painful reminder of loss and longing. The darkness whispered secrets, beckoning her to confront her fears. In that moment, she understood. The man in the window was not merely a harbinger of terror, but a guide through the shadows of her soul. Together, they stood at the threshold of her past, ready to face whatever horrors awaited. And as the darkness enveloped them, Maria realized that confronting her fears was not just about survival, but about understanding herself. The man in the window had led her to this pivotal moment, where she could choose to embrace her past or remain forever haunted by it. With newfound resolve, she took a step forward, knowing that the journey ahead would be both terrifying and liberating. The shadow in the room. It started with small things. Ethan would wake up in the middle of the night, feeling a strange weight on his chest. His room was always silent, dark, but something felt off. The first time it happened, he thought it was just a dream. But night after night, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. He'd glance around the room, but there was nothing, only shadows. At first, Ethan brushed it off. He had heard of sleep paralysis and assumed that's what was happening. But this felt different. Each night, the sensation of being watched became more intense. And every time he woke up, it was at the same time, 3 a.m. No matter how tired he was, something stirred him from his sleep, as if an unseen force was pulling him awake. One night, Ethan awoke with a start. His body was frozen, as if pinned down by an invisible weight. His breath quickened. In the corner of his room, something was there. A shadow, darker than the others, standing still. His heart raced as he struggled to move. The shadow didn't disappear when he blinked. It was real, and it was watching him. The next morning, Ethan dismissed it as another dream, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. The shadow had felt too real. That night, he left a lamp on, hoping the light would banish whatever was haunting him. But when he woke up at 3 a.m. again, the shadow was still there, taller now, and closer to his bed. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The shadow seemed to pulse with the darkness of the room, growing closer with every night. It didn't move in the way a person would, but it was unmistakably aware of him. Frozen in terror, Ethan could only watch as the shadow loomed over him, feeling its presence like a cold weight pressing against his skin. He started sleeping with the light on, but it didn't help. No matter how bright the room was, the shadow would still appear. It seemed to thrive in the darkness, feeding off Ethan's fear. Every time he opened his eyes at 3 a.m., it was there. Sometimes it stood still in the corner. Other times, it was right next to his bed. Ethan tried telling himself it was all in his head. But one night, he felt something new: movement. The shadow, which had always been still, now shifted. It moved, slowly at first, as if testing its ability. Then, it stretched toward him, long fingers of darkness creeping across the room. His skin prickled with fear as the air around him grew colder. He wanted to scream, but his voice was trapped. The shadow reached the edge of his bed, looming over him. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, hoping it would disappear. But the sensation of cold, shadowy fingers brushing his skin made him shudder. When he opened his eyes again, the shadow was gone, but the fear remained, deep in his bones. During the day, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He started avoiding his bedroom, spending as little time there as possible. But night always came, and with it, the shadow. One night, he decided to stay awake. Armed with a flashlight, he sat in bed, waiting for the clock to hit 3 a.m. At exactly 3 a.m., the room grew colder. His breath fogged the air. He turned the flashlight toward the corner where the shadow usually appeared. At first, there was nothing. Then, slowly, the shadow emerged, darker than before, almost solid. It seemed to ripple, if it were trying to take a shape. The beam of light did nothing to stop it. Ethan's hands trembled as the shadow moved closer. He could feel its presence now, like a heavy fog pressing down on him. His skin crawled as it approached. He couldn't move, couldn't look away. The darkness seemed to seep into the room, swallowing the light. The shadow wasn't just watching anymore. It was reaching out, trying to claim him. Terrified, Ethan jumped out of bed, stumbling toward the door. But the shadow followed, stretching along the walls, twisting and bending. It wasn't bound to the corner anymore. It was everywhere. He slammed the door shut behind him, but even in the hallway, the air felt heavy, thick with the same oppressive presence. The shadow was still with him. From that night on, Ethan never slept in his room again. He moved to the living room, hoping the shadow wouldn't follow. But each night, the same feeling returned: the cold, the sense of being watched. No matter where he went, he could feel it. The shadow had attached itself to him. It wasn't just in his room anymore, it was in his life. Ethan began to avoid sleeping altogether, staying awake as long as he could. But even during the day, the shadow was there. It would flicker in his peripheral vision, a dark blur just beyond his sight. He knew it was watching, waiting. His nights turned into a blur of sleepless terror, and his days were spent in constant fear. He tried everything: new lights, moving furniture, even staying at a friend's place. But no matter where he went, the shadow followed. It had become part of his existence. No longer confined to his room. It was everywhere, and it wasn't going to leave. Every night, 3 a.m. would come, and so would the shadow. Ethan knew he couldn't escape it. The shadow had become part of him, feeding on his fear, growing stronger with each passing night. The last thing he saw, on that final night, was the shadow standing over him, no longer just a presence in the corner, but fully formed. It had finally come for him, and there was nowhere left to run.